He almost walked past the dark shape in the frozen creek bed. It looked like just another shadow trapped under the ice of a brutal North Carolina winter. But then he felt it. Not a sound, not a cry. Just a sudden, heavy silence where the wind should have been. Corporal Ben Wilder, a 58-year-old recluse who had spent 20 years trying to forget the world, stopped. An instinct he thought had died in combat pulled him down the slippery bank. He cracked the thin ice with his weathered hands. Wedged between two freezing rocks lay the smallest German Shepherd puppy he had ever seen. She was barely breathing, her fur matted with ice, weighing less than a pound in his calloused palm. This wasn't just a runt. This was a creature fading out of existence. But as Ben pulled that trembling body against his faded field jacket, he realized this wasn't an accident. This was a disposal. A crime hidden in the snow, waiting for a man who knew what it meant to be left behind. If you believe that some souls are destined to save each other, this story is for you. Hit subscribe and let me know in the comments. Have you ever found something that changed your life when you weren't even looking? I read every single story. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The winter had settled over the Blue Ridge Mountains the way regret settles on a man who has lived too long with his ghosts. Quietly at first, then heavy enough to crush you. The snow drifted in thick sheets, swallowing the trails and muffling the forest into a silence so deep it felt like the world was holding its breath. Ben Wilder trudged toward the glowing lights of the wildlife clinic, his boots crunching through the fresh powder. The dawn light was gray and unforgiving. He moved like a man built from scar tissue. Shoulders hunched, gray beard matted with snow, piercing blue eyes fixed on the ground. A 58-year-old Army veteran, Ben wore his isolation like armor. People in town called him a hermit. They never called him broken, though they should have. He had come down from the mountain for supplies, nothing more. That was the plan. But now he stood in the sterile hallway of Dr. Ava Chen's clinic, snow melting from his old Army field jacket, clutching a bundle against his chest that was vibrating with weak, irregular heartbeats. Ava? You here? Dr. Ava Chen stepped out from an exam room, wiping her hands on a towel. She was sharp-eyed, tough, a woman who preferred animals to people because animals didn't lie. She saw Ben's face, pale beneath the weather-beaten skin, and stopped. Ben? You're never down here this early. What's wrong? He didn't speak. He just set the bundle on the metal table and peeled back the layers of his jacket. Ava inhaled sharply. Inside lay a German Shepherd puppy, but she looked wrong. Too small. Her head was shaped oddly, her ribs visible like delicate wire beneath patchy, wet fur. She lay perfectly still, her tiny chest fluttering with breaths that looked too thin to keep a body alive. Ava moved instantly, heating pad, stethoscope, fluids. She's freezing, Ben. Core temp is critical. I found her in the creek, Ben muttered, his voice rusty from disuse. Wedged in the rocks. That's impossible, Ava whispered, running her hands over the puppy's limbs. She's not a newborn. Look at her teeth. She's at least 5 weeks old. But she's the size of a rat, Ben said. Malnutrition, Ava murmured, her face hardening as she parted the fur on the puppy's neck. And something else. She grabbed a magnifying lamp. Ben leaned in, watching her face shift from concern to horror. What is it? Ava swallowed hard. Ben, look at this. Injection marks. A pattern of them. And here, chemical burns on her pads. She looked up, her eyes dark. This isn't just abandonment. Someone was experimenting on her. Look at her eyes. Ben looked. The puppy's eyes had drifted open. They weren't the milky blue of a newborn, but a striking, unnatural amber. And they were terrified. I've seen burns like this on tactical dogs, Ben said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. From chemical detection training. On a puppy this size? Ava shook her head. That's monstrous. They bred her small on purpose, Ben. And when she didn't work out, they threw her away like trash. Ben looked down at the puppy. A memory twisted inside him, sharp and violent. The memory of men he couldn't save. Of orders he shouldn't have followed. The feeling of being useful until you were broken and then being nothing. Can she make it? He asked. Ava didn't answer immediately. She watched the erratic rhythm on the monitor. Her heart is weak. Her lungs are full of fluid. She's been drugged, frozen, and starved. She placed a hand on Ben's arm. Ben. Sometimes the kindest thing is to end the pain. She reached for the sedative. The mercy shot. No, Ben said. The word came out like a command. Ben, look at her. I am looking at her, he growled. He stepped between Ava and the table, his large, trembling hand hovering over the tiny animal. She's not done. As if hearing him, the puppy shifted. She let out a sound, not a whimper but a low, defiant grunt. She dragged herself 1 inch, then 2, until her cold nose touched the callous skin of Ben's palm. She didn't pull away. She leaned into him. Ava froze. The monitor beeped, a rhythm that was faint but steadying. Ben lowered his voice, the gravel turning soft. She crawled to me, Ava. She's choosing to stay. Ava's eyes softened. She set the syringe down. If we do this, I can't promise anything. She might seize. She might stop breathing tonight. It's going to be a war to keep her alive. I know war, Ben said. For the first time in 20 years, the emptiness in his chest filled with something hot and necessary. I'm not leaving her. Okay, Ava whispered. Then we fight. Outside, the storm hammered against the clinic windows, burying the world in white. But inside, under the harsh exam light, a broken soldier and a broken dog made a silent pact to survive the winter. The mountain had teeth in January, and Ben Wilder had learned a long time ago that the only way to survive inside its mouth was to be harder than the frost. At 6 a.m., the thermometer nailed to the porch of his cabin read 8 degrees below zero. Ben stared at it through the grime of the kitchen window, his breath pluming in the unheated air. He took a slow pull from the bottle of cheap whiskey sitting on the counter. His breakfast, his coffee, his medicine against the ache in his hip that flared up whenever the pressure dropped. The burn going down was the only warmth he'd felt in days. He didn't want to go out. The fire was dead, the wood box empty, and the silence of the cabin was pressing against his ears like water depth. But the trap lines needed checking. Not because he needed the meat, he had enough venison jerky to last until spring, but because the routine was the only thing holding his days together. Without the routine, there was only the memory of the war and the bottle and the long dark drop into nothing. Ben pulled on his faded army field jacket, the canvas stiff with grease and age, and stepped out into the gray dawn. The snow was thigh-deep in the drifts, crusted over with a layer of ice that snapped like glass under his boots. He moved with the heavy, measured gait of a man who was no longer in a hurry to get anywhere. He checked the first 3 snares. Empty. Empty. A rabbit in the third, frozen solid. He bagged it without emotion, resetting the wire with hands that were scarred and steady. He should have turned back then. The wind was picking up, a low moan tearing through the pines that sounded too much like a dying man's exhale. But his boots found the deer trail leading down toward the creek and he followed it. Habit. Or maybe punishment. The creek was where the cold gathered, sinking into the valley floor until the air itself felt brittle. The water was frozen solid, a twisting ribbon of white winding through the black rocks. Ben walked the bank, eyes scanning the ice. He was looking for beaver sign, or maybe just looking for a reason to stay away from the empty cabin a few minutes longer. He almost missed it. It was just a smudge of darkness against the blinding white, wedged between 2 granite boulders where the current usually ran fast. A trick of the light. A clump of dead leaves. Ben took a step past it, then stopped. He didn't hear a cry. The wind was too loud for that. He didn't see movement. But the hair on the back of his neck stood up, a sensation he hadn't felt since the Korangal Valley. It was the feeling of being watched by something that was about to die. He slid down the embankment, his boots carving furrows in the snow. When he got close, he saw the ice wasn't solid between the rocks. There was a thin, jagged hole, and half submerged in the slush was a shape that made no sense. It looked like a rat. Or a drowned squirrel. Ben knelt, the cold seeping instantly through his jeans. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering. The shape was covered in ice crystals. Then a tremor. It was so faint he thought it was his own hand shaking. But the dark lump shuddered again. A convulsing, rhythmic jerk. Damn it, Ben whispered. The words scratched his throat. He shouldn't touch it. Nature was cruel and he was tired of interfering with death. He'd done enough of that in his life and it had never ended well. Leave it, a voice in his head said. It's practically gone. But his hands didn't listen. They were soldiers' hands trained to react before the brain could weigh the cost. He smashed the thin ice surrounding the shape with the heel of his palm and reached into the freezing slush. His fingers closed around wet fur. He lifted it out. It was impossibly light. A wet rag weighed more. As the water dripped away, the form resolved itself. Black and tan markings. Triangular ears plastered to a tiny skull. A tail tucked so far between its legs it touched the chin. A German shepherd. Ben stared, his mind stalling. This wasn't a dog. It was a ghost of a dog. It fit entirely in his palm, its limbs stiffening with the onset of rigor. But the heart, he could feel it against his fingertips. A rapid, frantic fluttering, like a moth trapped in a jar. "You poor son of a bitch," Ben breathed. The puppy gasped, a tiny jaw opening to suck in air that was too cold for its lungs. The sound was a rattle, wet and terrifying. Ben didn't think about the whiskey on the counter or the traps or the solitude he had carefully constructed for 20 years. He ripped the zipper of his field jacket down. He tore open the flannel shirt beneath it, exposing his chest to the biting wind. He shoved the freezing, wet animal inside his shirt, right against his skin. The shock of the ice-cold body against his warmth knocked the breath out of him. It burned like fire. But he clamped his jacket shut, trapping his body heat, creating a furnace. "Don't you quit," he growled, scrambling back up the bank, slipping, clawing at the roots. "You waited this long, you don't quit on me now." He ran. He hadn't run in years. His hips screamed, a hot wire of pain shooting down his leg, but he ignored it. He felt the puppy convulsing against his ribs. She was seizing from the temperature change, or maybe the dying was just entering its final stage. He reached his truck, a rusted-out Ford that looked like it had been part of the landscape since the 70s. He wrenched the door open, the metal groaning, and threw himself into the driver's seat. He didn't put the puppy on the seat. He kept her against his skin, one hand pressing her tight to his heart, the other fumbling with the keys. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. "Don't do this," Ben roared, slamming his hand against the dash. "Not today." He turned the key again. The engine caught with a roar and a cloud of black smoke. Ben threw it into gear and the truck lurched forward, fishtailing on the ice before the tires bit into the gravel. The drive to town was 40 minutes on a good day. Ben made it in 25. He drove with a focused, terrifying precision, sliding corners, riding the edge of the drop-offs. All the while he talked to the lump inside his jacket. "Stay with me. You hear? That's an order. Stay with me." The movement against his chest was slowing. The shivering was stopping. And Ben knew from too many nights in too many bad places that when the shivering stops, the end is close. He skidded into the parking lot of the Wildlife Rehabilitation Clinic, kicking up a spray of slush. The lights were on. Ava was always there early. He didn't bother shutting off the truck. He kicked the door open and sprinted for the entrance. He burst through the door, a wild-eyed giant covered in snow, smelling of old whiskey and pine needles. "Ava." Dr. Ava Chen was at the front desk, a mug of tea halfway to her mouth. She jumped, the tea sloshing over her hand. "Ben? What the hell?" "I need a table," he barked, marching past her into the exam room. "Now." Ava didn't ask questions. She saw the look in his eyes, the same look she'd seen on wild animals cornered in traps. Desperate. Dangerous. She followed him. Ben stood by the metal table and unzipped his jacket. He pulled the puppy out with trembling hands and laid her on the cold steel. "Oh my God," Ava whispered. The puppy was limp. Her wet fur revealed every rib, every vertebra. She looked like a skeleton draped in a wet pelt. "Hypothermia," Ben said, his voice cracking. "Found her in the creek." She stopped shivering. Ava moved like lightning. "Get the heating pad. Top shelf. Set it to low, not high, we can't cook her." She grabbed a stethoscope and pressed it to the tiny chest. "Heart rate is thready. Extremely low. She's in shock." Ben fumbled with the pad, his big hands clumsy. He slid it under the puppy. Ava was already inserting an IV the size of a hair into a vein in the puppy's leg. "She's dehydrated. Starved," Ava murmured, her face tight with anger. "Ben, this isn't a stray. Look at her nails. They've been trimmed. Recently." "I know," Ben said. He was leaning over the table, his breath fogging the air. She didn't get there by accident. They worked in silence for 10 minutes. Warm fluids. Oxygen mask. Gentle friction. Ben watched the monitor. Beep, beep, beep. "Come on," he whispered. He reached out and stroked the puppy's head with his thumb. The fur was drying, soft as down. Suddenly the puppy gasped. Her back arched. Her legs scrambled against the metal table, claws scratching for purchase. "Easy," Ava soothed. "I've got you." The puppy's head lifted. She shook, a violent tremor that started at her nose and went to her tail. And then her eyes opened. Ben stopped breathing. He had expected the dark brown of a dog or the blue of a baby. He wasn't ready for what looked back at him. Her eyes were amber. Bright, burning liquid gold. They were the color of the sun hitting the hazel trees in the late afternoon, the only warm thing in a frozen world. And they were looking right at him. Not past him. At him. There was intelligence there. And pain. And a question. Are you the one who hurts? Or the one who helps? Hazel, Ben said. The name fell out of his mouth before he could stop it. What? Ava asked, checking the foredrip. Her eyes, Ben said, unable to look away. They're like Hazelwood. Well, Hazel is a fighter, Ava said, exhaling a long breath. Her temp is coming up. But Ben. She paused, her voice losing its clinical edge. Look at her size. Look at the shape of her skull. The spacing of her eyes. What about it? She's 5 or 6 weeks old by her dentition. But she weighs 14 ounces. German shepherds that age should be 5-6 pounds. Ava looked at Ben, her expression grim. This isn't just a runt. And she wasn't just abandoned. Ava lifted the puppy's lip, showing gums that were pale but pinking up. I've seen dwarfism in wolves. It's rare. But this looks engineered. Ben felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the winter. He looked at the tiny creature, who had stopped thrashing and was now resting her chin on his thumb, watching him with those impossible golden eyes. Engineered? Ben asked. Bred, Ava corrected. Someone made her this way. And when she didn't turn out right, she gestured to the warming pad. They put her in the creek to wash away the mistake. Ben ran his thumb over the puppy's velvet ear. Hazel let out a soft sigh and closed her eyes, trusting him. Trusting the man who had spent 20 years proving he couldn't be trusted with a life. They didn't just put her in the creek, Ava, Ben said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. He turned the puppy's paw over, revealing the raw red burn mark on the pad. They tortured her first. As Ava stared at the burn, a phone began to ring in the back office. It was the private line, the one only used by the sheriff's department and local authorities. Ava frowned. Nobody calls that line this early. She went to answer it. Ben stayed with Hazel, his hand covering her entire body, shielding her. From the other room, he heard Ava's voice go sharp. Yes, Sheriff. No, I haven't seen anyone. Yes, a black truck? Why are you looking for it? Ben's hand froze on Hazel's back. Ava went silent, listening. Then she said, I see. I'll let you know. She walked back into the exam room. Her face was pale. That was the sheriff, she said quietly. He got a call from a private security firm. They said a disturbed local, in a black Ford truck, was seen stealing valuable property from a research site near the creek. Ben looked down at the 14 ounces of dying fur on the table. Property? Ben asked. They want it back, Ben, Ava whispered. And they're on their way here. Ava locked the front door of the clinic, flipping the sign to closed with a hand that shook slightly. Outside, the wind howled against the glass, masking the sound of the deadbolt sliding home. She turned back to Ben, her face setting grim lines. If the sheriff is looking for a black truck, she said, keeping her voice low, he won't look too hard in this weather. Not yet. But we don't have much time. She returned to the metal table where Hazel lay, the puppy's breathing shallow and ragged. Ava clicked on the overhead surgical lamp, the harsh light flooding the tiny, broken body. She reached for a pair of electric clippers. I need to see what we're dealing with, Ben. Hold her head. Ben placed his hands on the puppy. She was so small she practically disappeared beneath his palms. As the clippers hummed to life, shaving away patches of matted fur, the full horror of her condition began to reveal itself. My God, Ava whispered. Along the puppy's spine, the skin was translucent and blue-veined, but it was the marks that made Ben's stomach turn. Puncture wounds. A constellation of them along the flank and neck. They were already scabbing over, surrounded by yellow bruising. These aren't bite marks, Ben said, his voice rough. These are needle tracks. Different gauges, Ava noted, her fingers tracing the patterns. Some for drawing blood, some for injecting. Ben, look at the swelling here. They were pumping her with something. Muscle stimulants? Growth hormones? She moved to the paws. The pads, which should have been soft and black, were raw and weeping red fluid. The skin had blistered and peeled away. Chemical burns, Ava said, the professional detachment in her voice cracking. Harsh cleaning agents? No. This looks like exposure testing. Like they made her walk through something caustic to see if she'd tolerate the pain. Ben felt a surge of nausea that had nothing to do with the whiskey he'd had earlier. He looked at the tiny creature, barely the length of his hand. She's a baby, Ava. Why would they test pain tolerance on a baby? Because they wanted to see if she was tough enough, Ava said, moving the light to Hazel's shoulder. And she failed. Ava's fingers paused near the left shoulder blade. She frowned, pressing down. There's something here. Feels like a chip, but it's too deep. Too large. She grabbed a scalpel and a local anesthetic. I'm taking it out. If that's a tracker, it's how they found the creek. Ben held Hazel steady. He felt the puppy flinch as the needle went in, a tiny jerk of life in a body that looked dead. Ava worked quickly, making a small incision. She used forceps to dig into the muscle, fighting the tissue that had grown around the object. With a wet snick, she pulled it free and dropped it into a metal tray. It didn't clink like glass. It landed with a heavy, metallic thud. It wasn't the size of a grain of rice. It was a silver capsule, almost an inch long, stamped with a serial number that was too small to read without magnification. Ava picked it up with tweezers, holding it under the light. That's not a standard Avid chip. That's military-grade telemetry. GPS biometrics. Ben, this transmits heart rate and body temp in real time. That's why they called. Ben realized, his blood running cold. They didn't just lose her. They saw her heart stop when the cold hit her. They saw it start again when I put her in my shirt. They know she's alive, Ava said, dropping the chip into a lead-lined box she used for X-ray plates. And they know exactly where the signal died. Suddenly the puppy screamed. It was a sound that didn't belong in a living thing, a high, tearing shriek that cut through the room. Hazel's body went rigid. Her back arched violently, lifting off the table, and her tiny jaws snapped open and shut on empty air. Seizure. Ava yelled. Hold her, Ben. Don't let her fall. Ben scooped the thrashing body into his hands. She was vibrating so hard her teeth clicked together. Foam bubbled at the corners of her mouth. The heat of the room seemed to vanish. The smell of antiseptic was replaced by the smell of diesel and burning rubber. The white walls dissolved into blinding white sand. Ben wasn't in a clinic in North Carolina. He was in the Korangal Valley, kneeling in the dust beside a Humvee that was smoking black into the blue sky. He wasn't holding a puppy. He was holding Private Jake Morrison. Jake was 22. He was convulsing, his body rejecting the shrapnel that had torn through his neck. His blood was hot and sticky on Ben's hands. Corporal, Jake gurgled, his eyes wide, looking at Ben with terrified trust. Don't leave me. I got you, kid, Ben shouted, his voice echoing in the clinic. Stay with me. Look at me. The puppy thrashed, her claws digging into Ben's wrist. I'm cold, Jake whispered. The light was fading from his eyes. Ben squeezed him tighter, trying to push his own life into the dying boy. Don't let go. Ben. The voice cut through the memory like a knife. Ben gasped, blinking hard. The sand vanished. Ava was staring at him, a syringe in her hand. Ben, she's stopping. It's passing. Ben looked down. Hazel was limp in his hands. She wasn't seizing anymore. She was just a small, wet scrap of fur, her chest heaving as she fought for air. The foam on her lips was pink with blood where she'd bitten her tongue. I've got her, Ben whispered, his voice trembling. He pulled her against his chest, right over his heart. I've got you. I'm not leaving. Ava injected a sedative into the foreline, her hands gentle. It's the withdrawal, she said softly, watching Ben's face. Whatever they had her on, it's clearing her system. Her brain is misfiring. She looked at Ben, really looked at him, seeing the ghost he was still staring at. You were somewhere else just now. I was where I always am, Ben muttered. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. She can't stay here, Ava. If that chip was transmitting, they know the signal ended at this building. I have a duty to report animal cruelty, Ava said, though her voice lacked conviction. We call the state police. We give them the chip. The sheriff already called you, Ben snapped. They claimed she was stolen property. You think the state police are going to care about one dead puppy when a military contractor shows up with paperwork? He shook his head. They'll take her. They'll finish what the creek didn't do. And they'll call it disposal of hazardous materials. Ava looked at the lead box where the chip lay. She looked at the burns on the puppy's feet. She knew he was right. Take her, Ava said. She moved to the supply cabinets, pulling down boxes. Here. Sub-Q fluids. Syringes. Antibiotics. And this. She grabbed a silver canister from the top shelf. It's a specialized high-calorie formula. It's the only thing her stomach might tolerate right now. She packed it all into a duffel bag and shoved it into his arms. Go to the cabin, she instructed. Don't stop. Don't answer the phone. If the sheriff comes here, I'll tell him I found the chip in a coyote scat and the truck was just passing through. Ben nodded. He tucked Hazel back inside his jacket, feeling the faint warmth of her body against his scars. Thank you, Ava. Keep her alive, Ben, she whispered. Just keep her alive. The drive back up the mountain was a blur of white-knuckled tension. The snow was falling harder now, erasing his tracks as soon as he made them. Good. Let the mountain swallow him. When he reached the cabin, he didn't park in the usual spot. He drove the truck around the back, jamming it into the old woodshed and pulling the tarp over the bumper. He killed the engine and listened. Silence. Just the wind. Inside, the cabin was freezing. Ben moved with efficient speed. He stoked the wood stove until the iron belly glowed cherry red. He pulled the mattress off his bed and dragged it into the living room, placing it right in front of the fire. He made a nest out of his spare wool blankets and his old army field jacket, the one he'd worn the day Jake died. He placed Hazel in the center of it. She was sleeping the deep, coma-like sleep of the exhausted, but she was warm. Ben sat on the floor beside her, his back against the wood box, a shotgun resting across his knees. He watched the firelight dance on her fur. She was so small, so broken. "Don't let go," Jake had said. "I won't," Ben promised the sleeping dog. Hours passed. The wind rattled the door hinges. Around midnight, Hazel stirred and let out a hungry mule. Ben reached for the duffel bag Ava had packed. He pulled out the silver canister of formula. He needed to mix it with warm water. He took the can to the kitchen counter and lit a kerosene lamp. The metal glinted in the flickering light. He frowned. It wasn't the commercial brand Ava usually sold. It looked industrial. There was a label on the bottom, printed with a batch code and a logo he didn't recognize, a stylized mountain peak with a sword running through it. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. It buzzed again. And again. He pulled it out. A text from Ava. "I ran the chemical analysis on the residue in her stomach and checked the supplier for that formula tin I gave you. It's not retail. It's a proprietary blend. Only one client orders it." Ben looked at the can in his hand. He turned it over, reading the fine print under the logo. Distributed by Mountain Ridge Tactical K-9 Academy. Authorized personnel only. He stared at the name. Mountain Ridge. He knew that name. He knew who ran it. The man's face floated up from the deep recesses of his memory, smiling a smile that never reached his eyes. A man who had stood over a map 20 years ago and pointed to the wrong coordinates. Ben's hand tightened around the can until the metal creaked. The enemy wasn't just a faceless corporation. The enemy was the past coming back to finish the job. He looked down at the receipt Ava had sent in the next text image. The signature at the bottom of the order form was unmistakable. Colonel Marcus Brennan. Ben looked from the phone to the puppy sleeping in his jacket. This wasn't just a rescue anymore. It was a war. And this time he knew exactly who he was fighting. 72 hours is a lifetime when you're measuring it in shallow breaths. For 3 days, Ben Wilder didn't sleep. He sat in the worn leather armchair position between the wood stove and the makeshift nest on the floor, watching Hazel fight. The cabin smelled of wood smoke, rubbing alcohol, and the stale, metallic scent of old coffee. When Hazel slept, Ben worked. He had an ancient satellite laptop that took 10 minutes to load a web page, but he had time. He typed the name from the bottom of the formula can. Mountain Ridge Tactical K-9 Academy. The screen glowed blue in the dark cabin, illuminating the deep lines of Ben's face. The website was sleek. High-definition videos showed muscular German shepherds leaping into helicopters, taking down men in bite suits, standing stoically beside soldiers in desert camo. The text was full of buzzwords: elite, uncompromising, the apex of genetic engineering. And then he found the About the Founder page. Ben's hand froze on the trackpad. The face staring back at him was older, heavier, but the eyes were the same, flat, pale gray, devoid of anything resembling a soul. Colonel Marcus Brennan, Ret. Ben felt the phantom ache in his hip flare into a scream. He knew that face. He knew that smile. 20 years ago, Brennan had been a major. He had been the operations coordinator who radioed the coordinates for the airstrike. The coordinates that were off by 200 meters. The coordinates that turned Ben's squad into ash and silence. Brennan had testified at the inquiry. He had looked Ben in the eye and said, Corporal Wilder was under extreme duress. He may have relayed the wrong grid. He had said it with sympathy. He had lied with the perfect polished ease of a man who believed his own fiction. You, Ben whispered to the empty room. It had to be you. A sound from the floor broke his trance. It was a wet, rattling cough. Ben was on his knees instantly. Hazel was awake, but her eyes, those strange amber lamps, were dull. She opened her mouth to breathe, but only a wheeze came out. Her gums were turning a muddy gray. Hazel? Ben touched her chest. It was vibrating, a terrifying liquid rattle. No. No, don't you do this. She arched her neck, gasping, drowning on dry land. The fluid in her lungs, a parting gift from the frozen creek, was overwhelming her. Ben grabbed the stethoscope Ava had left. He pressed it to her ribs. It sounded like a storm inside a paper bag. Pneumonia. Or heart failure. He grabbed the phone to call Ava, but his thumb hovered over the screen. Ava was a wildlife vet. She was brilliant, but she was 40 minutes away and she had already done what she could. This needed more. This needed oxygen tents, nebulizers, drugs he didn't have. And if he took her back to the clinic, the sheriff and Brennan's security team would be waiting. He was watching her die. Again. He looked at the contact list on his phone. There was one name he hadn't touched in 5 years. A name that represented a different kind of failure. Sarah. His daughter. The state animal crimes investigator. Ben's hand shook. He would rather walk back into a minefield than make this call. He would rather face Brennan alone. But Hazel let out another desperate fluid-filled gasp, her tiny paws paddling the air. Ben hit the button. It rang 4 times. He almost hung up. Then a voice. Sharp, professional, guarded. This is Investigator Wilder. Ben closed his eyes. Sarah. Silence. A silence so heavy it felt like it could crush the cabin roof. Dad. Her voice lost its edge, replaced by a cold shock. Dad, is that you? I need help, Ben rasped. The words tasted like ash. And, I'm sorry. You're sorry? The anger was instantaneous, hot and justified. 5 years, Dad. 5 years of nothing. You missed Mom's funeral. You missed everything. And you call to say you're sorry? I have a puppy, Ben said, talking over his own shame because there wasn't time for it. German Shepherd. 5 weeks old. Weighs less than a pound. Signs of systemic abuse, chemical burns, genetic manipulation. She's dying, Sarah. Pneumonia. The silence returned, but the quality changed. The daughter was gone. The investigator was listening. Where did you get a dog like that? I found her in the creek. She has a military tracker I cut out. And she came from Marcus Brennan. He heard her intake of breath. Brennan? The Mountain Ridge facility? Yes. I have the formula can with his signature. Sarah, she's suffocating. I can't take her to town. They're looking for her. I'm coming, she said. No hesitation. I'll be there in 3 hours. Keep her warm. Keep her upright. Sarah. Don't, she cut him off. We're not talking. I'm doing my job. The storm broke just as the gray state-issued SUV crunched up the driveway. Ben stood on the porch watching his daughter step out. She was 32 now. She looked like her mother, same dark hair, same sharp nose, but she stood like Ben. Feet planted, shoulders square, jaw set in a line that promised a fight. She carried a heavy medical case in one hand and a tactical bag in the other. She walked up the steps. Ben made a move, an aborted gesture of greeting, maybe a hand reaching out. Sarah walked right past him. Where is she? By the fire, Ben said, dropping his hand. Sarah knelt by the nest. Her movements were precise, clinical. She pulled a nebulizer from her bag, hooked it to a portable battery, and placed the mask over Hazel's muzzle. She injected a steroid, then a diuretic. Breath sounds are terrible, Sarah muttered, her eyes glued to the puppy's chest. But she's fighting. God, she's tiny. She worked for 20 minutes, adjusting flows, checking vitals. Slowly, the terrifying rattle in Hazel's chest eased. The gasps turned into rhythmic, shallow breaths. The gray in her gums turned back to pale pink. Sarah sat back on her heels, wiping her forehead. Only then did she look at Ben. You kept her alive, she said. It wasn't a compliment, it was a statement of fact. She kept herself alive, Ben said, standing by the mantelpiece, feeling too big and too useless in his own home. I just warmed her up. Sarah turned her attention to the silver formula sitting on the table. She picked it up, reading the label, her expression darkening. Dad, she said, her voice tight. This isn't just one sick puppy. What do you mean? For the last 18 months, we've been finding bodies, Sarah said. She stood up, pacing the small room. 8 of them. All German Shepherd puppies. All newborns or very young. Found in dumpsters, in ditches, one in a landfill 3 counties over. Ben felt the blood drain from his face. Killed? Euthanized? Or left to die, Sarah corrected. But they were all in different jurisdictions, so nobody connected the dots. We call it the ghost litter. We thought it was a backyard breeder trying to get rid of defects. Club foot, cleft palates, blindness. She pointed to Hazel. But she matches the profile perfectly. Except for one thing. What? Ben asked. She's alive, Sarah said. And she doesn't have a physical deformity like the others. She's just small. It's not just that, Ben said. Look at the injection marks on her flank. Ava said they were testing her pain tolerance. And the tracking chip. You don't put military telemetry on a throwaway dog. Sarah looked at the formula can again. Mountain Ridge. We've never been able to get a warrant for them. They're protected. High-level clearance. They supply dogs to the Secret Service, private contractors, overseas ops. If I try to walk in there, I get shut down by the feds before I reach the gate. Brennan is cleaning up his mistakes, Ben said, his voice low and dangerous. He's breeding for something specific. And if they don't meet the standard, he erases them. And spreads the bodies across 5 counties so no one sees the pattern, Sarah finished. Smart. Evil but smart. She looked at Ben, then really looked at him. The anger was still there, but beneath it was confusion. Why you, Dad? She asked quietly. Why did you pick her up? You walked away from everything else. You walked away from us. The question hung in the air, heavier than the smoke. Ben looked at his hands, hands that knew how to kill, how to break, and now, apparently, how to save. I didn't leave because I didn't care, Sarah, he said, his voice cracking. I left because I'm dangerous. That's a cop-out. Is it? Ben stepped forward into the light. I followed orders that killed 3 boys who hadn't even started shaving yet. I came home and I drank until I couldn't hear their screams, and then I started hearing yours and your mother's instead. I was poisoned, Sarah. I didn't leave to save myself. I left to save you from me. Sarah's expression wavered. I never needed a hero, Dad. I didn't need you to be perfect. I just needed my father. I needed you to stay. I know, Ben whispered. I know. He saw the tears in her eyes, the years of accumulated hurt. He wanted to step forward, to hug her, to bridge the gap he had blasted into their lives. But before he could move, a sound from the floor stopped them both. Hazel let out a sharp, high-pitched yelp. Sarah spun around. She's crashing again. She dropped to her knees. Hazel was convulsing, her back bowing off the mattress. Hand me the diazepam. Sarah yelled, snapping into command mode. The blue vial. Now. Ben moved. He grabbed the vial, tossed it to her. Sarah drew it up, her hand steady. Hold her head, Dad. Don't let her bite her tongue. Ben clamped his hands gently around the tiny skull. He felt the electric storm firing in her brain. He leaned down, putting his face right next to hers. Focus, Hazel, he commanded, his voice a low rumble against her ear. You hold the line. You hear me? Hold the line. Sarah pushed the plunger. They froze, 2 generations of Wilders united over 14 ounces of dying fur. Slowly the seizing stopped. Hazel went limp, her breathing smoothing out into a rhythmic, fragile puff against Ben's cheek. Sarah exhaled, slumping back against the armchair. She looked at Ben, her eyes wide. She listens to you, she whispered. Did you see that? Her heart rate dropped the second you spoke. Ben looked down at the puppy. Hazel's eyes were open again, barely slits, but she was looking at him. She's a soldier, Ben said softly. Sarah picked up the formula can again, turning it over in her hands. Her face hardened. If she's a soldier, Dad, then she's AWOL. And Brennan isn't just looking for a lost piece of property. She tapped the logo on the can. I just remembered something. The other 8 puppies? The dead ones? None of them had chips. They were clean. Ben looked up, a chill crawling up his spine. But Hazel had a military tracker. Exactly, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Which means she wasn't just a mistake he threw away. She was a project he lost. And he is going to tear this mountain apart to get her back. Ben stood up, walking to the window. He looked out into the dark, swirling snow. Somewhere out there, beyond the trees, engines were idling. Let him come, Ben said. I'm done running. The laptop screen cast a pale, sickly light over Sarah's face. She hit the enter key one last time, waited for the database to cycle, and then slammed the lid shut in frustration. Nothing, she spat, rubbing her temples. Absolutely nothing. Ben sat by the fire, feeding split logs into the stove. Hazel was asleep in his lap, wrapped in a wool blanket, her breathing audible but steady. How is that possible? Ben asked. Because they're protected, Sarah said, pacing the small cabin floor. I ran Brennan, the academy, the holding company. It's spotless. Defense contracts, glowing inspections from the USDA, commendations from the Department of Homeland Security. On paper, Mountain Ridge is the gold standard of K-9 training facilities. If I try to get a warrant based on a hunch and a stolen formula can, the judge will laugh me out of chambers. Ben looked down at the puppy. The hunch had chemical burns on her feet and a military tracker in her shoulder. The paper is a lie. I know it's a lie, Dad. But the law loves paper. The phone on the table buzzed. It wasn't Sarah's work phone. It was Ben's. He picked it up. Ava. He answered on speaker. Ava? Everything all right? Ben? Ava's voice was tight, trembling with a mixture of fear and disbelief. I just got a call. On the clinic's private line. It was my brother. Ben frowned. Marcus? I thought you hadn't spoken in 3 years. I haven't, Ava said. He sounded different. Broken. Ben, he knows about the puppy. He knows about the burns. He told me. She took a shaky breath. He told me he's the one who left her in the creek. Sarah stopped pacing. She moved to the phone, her investigator eyes locking onto Ben's. Where is he? He wants to meet, Ava said. The old ranger station at Black Bear Ridge. It's abandoned. He said he has proof, but he won't talk over the phone. He said he's running out of time. The ranger station was a skeleton of rotting wood and shattered glass, sitting deep in the shadow of the mountain. Ben killed the truck's engine 100 yards out. He checked the pistol tucked into his waistband, a habit he thought he'd left in the desert, and looked at Sarah. You stay in the truck with Hazel. Not a chance, Sarah said, already opening her door. This is my investigation. They walked through the knee-deep snow together, the wind biting at their exposed skin. Inside the ruin of the station, a figure was waiting. Marcus Chen didn't look like a villain. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a month. He was gaunt, his face gray and hollowed out, shivering in a coat that wasn't heavy enough for this altitude. When he saw Ben, he didn't step forward. He stepped back, his hands raised in surrender. She's alive? Marcus asked, his voice cracking. Ava said she made it? She's alive, Ben growled, stepping into the shelter. No thanks to you. Marcus let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. I didn't think she would, but I had to try. It was the only way to get her out without them knowing. Start talking, Sarah said, her voice freezing the air between them. Who are you and what is going on at that academy? Marcus leaned against the rotting wall, looking at Ben. I'm an admin assistant. Logistics. I process the orders. The contracts. He rubbed his face with shaking hands. Mountain Ridge isn't just a training facility. It's a genetic engineering project. Brennan calls it tactical perfection. He's breeding them, Ben said. He's manufacturing them, Marcus corrected. Millions in contracts with private military firms, foreign security details, off-book ops. They want dogs that don't hesitate. Dogs that don't fear. Dogs that don't feel. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy encrypted hard drive. He held it tight like it was a grenade. They test them from birth, Marcus whispered. Aggression thresholds. Pain tolerance. Emotional reactivity. They want machines in fur coats. If a puppy shows fear, it's a defect. If it shows gentleness, it's a defect. He looked at the bulge in Ben's jacket where Hazel was tucked away. That one. Subject 7 Delta. She failed the temperament test at 3 weeks. The note said she was hypersensitive to human emotional distress. She didn't attack the agitator. She tried to comfort him. Ben felt Hazel shift against his chest. Too reactive to human distress. The very thing that made her crawl to him on the ice. In Brennan's world, empathy is a fatal flaw, Marcus said bitterly. It makes the weapon unreliable. So the protocol is disposal. Disposal, Sarah repeated, the word tasting like bile. You mean murder? I mean worse, Marcus said. He drugs them so they can't walk, drives them out to remote locations and lets the elements do the work. No bullets. No blood. Just nature. He calls it returning them to the wild. I've processed the paperwork for 47 failed units in the last 3 years. Sarah looked sick. This is eugenics. For animals. It's worse, Marcus said. He's using military grants to do it. He's selling it as national security. Ben took a step closer. The rage inside him was cold and sharp. Why did you put her in the creek, Marcus? Why there? Marcus looked Ben in the eye. The shame on his face was absolute. I couldn't watch another one die, he whispered. I researched the area. I knew you lived in that cabin. I knew you walked that creek line every morning at dawn to check your traps. I saw your file, Ben. I saw what happened to your squad. Ben froze. You were alone, Marcus continued, his voice trembling. You were broken. And you had nothing left to lose. I thought, maybe you'd understand what it felt like to be thrown away. Ben felt the air leave his lungs. He hadn't been chosen at random. He had been chosen because of his scars. Because this man saw a kinship between a discarded soldier and a discarded dog. You used me, Ben said softly. I gave her a chance, Marcus pleaded. And she saved you, didn't she? You're here. You're fighting. He thrust the hard drive into Sarah's hands. Everything is on there. The breeding logs. The disposal coordinates. Videos of the euthanasia. The financial records linking Brennan to the disposal orders. It's enough to bury him. Why are you giving us this now? Sarah asked, pocketing the drive. Because the chips stopped transmitting, Marcus said, his eyes darting to the tree line. They know she didn't die. They tracked the signal to the clinic and then it vanished. Brennan isn't just looking for a lost dog anymore. He's looking for a leak. He grabbed Ben's arm. His grip was desperate. He's building an empire, Ben. He wants to be the man who created the perfect killer. He won't let a 14-ounce mistake destroy that. He's sending his team. Let him come, Ben said. You don't understand. Marcus hissed. These aren't dog catchers. They're private contractors. Ex-mercs. They have thermal scopes, Ben. They have silence. You have maybe 48 hours before they grid search this mountain and find your cabin. Marcus stepped back into the shadows of the station. Get her out of here, he warned. Make it count. She deserves to be the one that ends this. Where are you going? Ava asked, speaking for the first time from the doorway. I have to go back, Marcus said, pulling his collar up. If I run now, they'll know it was me. I have to buy you time. He looked at his sister one last time, then vanished into the swirling snow. Ben stood in the ruin, the weight of the hard drive in Sarah's pocket feeling heavier than lead. He looked down at Hazel, tucked inside his jacket. She wasn't a mistake. She was the only thing in this world that made sense. 48 hours, Sarah said, her voice steady. We need to leave. Now. No, Ben said. He turned to look back toward his cabin, toward the high ground of the mountain he had hidden in for 20 years. If we run, they hunt us. If we run, we're just prey. He touched the pistol at his waist. We don't run, Ben said. We dig in. Back at the cabin, Ben cleared the kitchen table. He laid out the hard drive, a map of the surrounding woods and his old service rifle. He watched Hazel sleeping by the fire, twitching as she dreamed. She was dreaming of milk, of warmth. She didn't know she was the most dangerous evidence in the state. But as Ben cleaned his rifle, the silence of the mountain was broken. Not by wind. Not by a coyote. But by the distinct, rhythmic thwop-thwop-thwop of a drone rotor cutting through the snowy air directly above the cabin roof. The 48 hours Marcus promised hadn't been a guarantee. They had been a wish. Ben looked up at the ceiling, his eyes narrowing. The time for hiding was over. The hunt had already begun. The laptop screen was the only light left in the world. It cast a harsh, blue square onto the rough-hewn timber of the kitchen table, illuminating the horror in high definition. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving a silence so heavy it pressed against the window panes. Inside, the only sound was the hum of the hard drive and the soft, rhythmic breathing of Hazel. She was asleep between Ben and Sarah, curled into a ball of black and tan fur, her paws twitching as she chased imaginary rabbits through dream snow. She looked peaceful. The screen told a different story. This is... Sarah stopped, her hand covering her mouth. She scrolled down the spreadsheet Marcus had provided. 47 entries. Subject terminated due to failure to meet aggression benchmarks. Subject terminated due to excessive timidity. Dad, look at the dates. He's been doing this for 3 years. Ben leaned in, his eyes scanning the columns. It was a ledger of slaughter, written in the sterile language of logistics. Asset disposal. Biowaste management. Open the video folder, Ben said. His voice was flat, the voice of a man walking into a room he knew was mined. Sarah hesitated, then clicked the file dated 2 months prior. The video opened. It showed a sterile white room with a stainless steel table, just like the one at Ava's clinic, but cleaner, colder. A litter of 6 puppies, maybe 4 weeks old, huddled together in a plastic crate. A man walked into the frame. Tall, wearing a pristine gray suit. He didn't look at the puppies. He looked at a clipboard. Batch 4 Alpha, the man said. Test results indicate uniform failure in stress inoculation. Genetic line is compromised. Proceed with liquidation. Sarah made a choked sound. She slammed the laptop shut, scrambling out of her chair. I can't. I'm gonna be sick. She bolted for the bathroom. The door slammed, followed by the sound of retching. Ben sat alone in the dark. He reached out and slowly opened the laptop again. He had to see. He had to know the face of the enemy. On the screen, the man in the gray suit watched as the technician began injecting the puppies. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He looked bored. "Weakness is a disease," the man said to the technician, his voice smooth and cultured. "We aren't killing them. We're doing them a favor. In the wild they just starve. Here we ensure the strength of the pack." Ben froze. It wasn't the cruelty that stopped his heart. It was the voice. He closed his eyes and suddenly the cabin was gone. The snow was gone. He was standing in the blinding heat of the Korangal Valley. The air tasted of copper and dust. The radio in his hand was slick with sweat. "Command, this is Viper 2-6. We are taking heavy fire. I repeat, heavy fire. We need air support on grid 774. Over." Static. Then a voice. "Come." Detached. The same smooth baritone he had just heard on the laptop. "Viper 2-6, copy. Coordinates received. 774. Hold position. Rain is coming." Rain was the code for the airstrike. Ben had held his position. He had ordered his men to dig in. Private Jake Morrison, 22 years old, had looked at him and smiled, trusting him. The bombs didn't hit the ridge line where the enemy was. They hit the valley floor. They hit Viper 2-6. Ben opened his eyes. He was back in the cabin. His hands were shaking so hard the table vibrated. He grabbed the mouse and minimized the video. He opened the folder marked Personal Archive. He typed a date. October 14, 2005. The file opened. A scanned document. After action report, Operation Red Sand. Ben read the summary. Casualties 3 Kia 4 WIA. Cause: friendly fire due to incorrect coordinates relayed by ground element. That was the lie he had lived with for 20 years. The lie that had cost him his marriage, his daughter, his soul. But Marcus had given them everything, including the unredacted comms log. Ben scrolled down. There it was. The transmission log from the Tactical Operations Center. Caller: Viper 2-6, Corporal Wilder. Request: air support. Coordinates relayed by Viper 2-6, 770. Ben stared at the number. He had called it right. He had called the ridge line. He looked at the next line. Relayed to air asset by OPS coordinator, Major Brennan 774. Brennan. Brennan had transposed the numbers. It was a clerical error. A slip of the tongue. But instead of owning it, instead of facing the inquiry, Brennan had altered the log. He had let the corporal take the fall. He had let Ben destroy himself to protect his own career. He knew, Ben whispered. The rage started in his gut, a cold, hard knot that expanded until it filled the room. He looked me in the eye at the hearing and he knew. Sarah walked back into the room, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. She looked pale, shaken. "Dad?" she asked, seeing his face. "What is it?" Ben turned the laptop toward her. He pointed to the log. "I didn't kill them, Sarah." Sarah leaned in, reading the text. Her eyes widened. She looked from the screen to her father, the pieces clicking into place. The years of drinking. The isolation. The refusal to hold his grandson. All of it built on a foundation of guilt that belonged to another man. "He changed the coordinates," Sarah whispered. "He made the mistake. And he let you burn for it." Ben stood up. The ache in his hip was gone. The fog of the whiskey was gone. "He said weakness is a disease," Ben said, his voice low and terrifyingly steady. "He thinks compassion is a defect. He killed Jake Morrison to save his rank. And now he's killing these dogs because they have too much heart." He looked down at Hazel. She was awake now, sitting up, her head cocked to the side, watching him. "I spent 20 years thinking I was the monster," Ben said. "Thinking I deserved this dark." He reached down and picked up his service rifle from the table. The metal was cold and heavy and familiar. "I was wrong," Ben said. "The monster is wearing a medal. And he's sitting in an office 10 miles from here." Sarah stared at him. She didn't see the broken hermit she had arrived to find. She saw the man she remembered from her childhood, the one who stood tall, the one who protected. "We take him down," Sarah said, her voice hardening. "For Jake. For Hazel. For all of them. We give this drive to the feds and we bury him." "We need a plan," Ben said. "If we drive out of here, they'll intercept us on the main road." Marcus said they have thermal. "They'll see the heat signature of the engine miles away." "We can hike to the ridge," Sarah suggested. "Get a signal, upload the files to the cloud. Once it's online, he can't stop it." Ben nodded. "The ridge is 3 miles. Uphill. In snow." "I can make it," Sarah said. "What about her?" Ben pointed to Hazel. She goes in your jacket, Sarah said. Where she belongs. They began to pack, batteries, water, ammunition. The mood in the cabin had shifted. It wasn't a shelter anymore. It was a staging area. Suddenly Hazel stood up. She didn't whimper. She didn't cry. She went rigid, her tiny body vibrating with tension. She turned toward the front door, her hackles, the sparse fur along her spine, raising up. A low, guttural growl vibrated in her throat. Ben froze. Quiet. Sarah looked at the dog. What is it? She senses something, Ben whispered. Marcus said she was reactive to intent. Hazel backed up, pressing her body against Ben's leg, her eyes locked on the door. She wasn't looking at the wood, she was looking at what was coming through it. Then the hum of the refrigerator died. The blue light of the laptop screen flickered and went black. The darkness was absolute. They cut the power, Ben said. The generator line. Sarah reached for her flashlight, but Ben's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. No light, he hissed. They have night vision. If you light up, you're a target. Through the walls of the cabin, a sound drifted in. It wasn't the wind. It was the crunch of heavy tires on snow rolling slow, rolling dark. They're here, Sarah breathed. Marcus was wrong, Ben said, moving to the window, peering through the crack in the curtains. He saw nothing but blackness, but he felt the pressure of the enemy closing in. They didn't wait 48 hours. He turned to Sarah. In the dark, he couldn't see her face, but he could feel her fear. Get Hazel, Ben commanded. Back door. We go to the woodshed. My truck is there. Dad, you said they'd see the engine heat. They will, Ben said, chambering around in his rifle. The sound was loud in the quiet room. That's why I'm not driving it. You are. What? You take the truck. You go down the logging road. You draw them off. I am not leaving you. Sarah's voice rose, panic edging in. I am not leaving you behind again. Listen to me. Ben grabbed her shoulders. They want the evidence. You have the drive. You have the truck. They'll follow the heat. I'll take Hazel and go on foot to the ridge. I know these woods. They don't. Dad. Sarah, Ben said, his voice softening. You said you needed your father. This is me being your father. I need you to survive this. I need you to finish it. A heavy thud hit the front porch. A boot testing the weight. Hazel snarled, a fierce, tiny sound of defiance. Go, Ben whispered. Now. Sarah hesitated for one heartbeat, then grabbed the keys from the table. I'll see you at the trailhead. Don't you dare die on me. Move. Sarah vanished into the shadows of the back room. Ben scooped up Hazel, shoving her deep into his jacket. He felt her heart hammering against his own. Okay, girl, Ben whispered into the dark. You and me against the world. Just like old times. He raised the rifle, aiming at the front door. The knob began to turn slowly. But it wasn't the door that exploded inward. It was the window behind him. Glass shattered, and a canister hissed across the floor, spewing white smoke. Yes. Ben coughed, his eyes stinging instantly. He didn't wait for the door to open. He didn't wait for the team to breach. He kicked the back door open and launched himself into the freezing night, Hazel pressed tight to his chest, running straight into the teeth of the enemy. The back door of the cabin shattered outward, not from a kick, but from the force of Ben and Sarah diving into the snow. The white smoke of the tear gas billowed out behind them, a ghostly plume instantly snatched away by the wind. Move, Ben coughed, his eyes streaming. Stay low. Into the tree line. The plan to split up was dead before it started. Two black SUVs were already idling by the woodshed, their headlights cutting through the swirling snow, blocking the truck. Men were spilling out, shadows in tactical black, moving with the fluid precision of predators. Clear left, a voice shouted. Perimeter secure. Ben grabbed Sarah's arm, hauling her into the cover of the dense hemlocks. Give me the dog, he whispered, wiping his eyes. No, Sarah hissed, tucking the bulge in her jacket tighter. You have the rifle. I have the package. Lead the way. She was right. Ben shifted his grip on the service rifle, the cold steel biting into his gloves. He didn't look back at the house that had been his prison and his sanctuary for 20 years. He looked at the mountain. Uphill, Ben commanded. To the fire tower. It's the only defensible ground. They moved. The snow was knee-deep here, a sucking heavy weight that grabbed at their boots. Ben took point, his body remembering the rhythm of a patrol. Step, scan, listen. Step, scan, listen. Below them, the lights of the tactical team swept the trees. These weren't cops. Cops shouted warnings. These men moved in silence. Ben squinted through the dark, catching the silhouette of the point man. He recognized the gait, heavy, aggressive. "That's Miller," Ben muttered. "Dishonorable discharge. Dangerous." "You know him?" Sarah panted, struggling to keep pace in the drift. "I know his type," Ben said. "He works for contractors who don't ask questions." A burst of static cut through the air. Ben stopped, raising a hand. He had snatched a radio off his belt, his old scanner tuned to the unencrypted frequencies these teams usually used for short-range comms. "Target is mobile," a voice crackled. "Footprints heading north-northwest. Towards the ridge." "Rules of engagement?" The answer came back cold and clear. "Retrieve the asset. Eliminate witnesses if necessary. Make it look like an exposure accident." Sarah froze. "Eliminate witnesses? Dad, this isn't a retrieval. This is a cleanup." "I told you," Ben said, pushing her forward. "We're not people to them. We're loose ends." They clawed. The wind screamed through the pass, blinding them with ice pellets. It was the kind of cold that shut down organs, the kind of night where things went to sleep and never woke up. Ben used the terrain. He led them through brambles that would tear at the pursuers' gear, across ice sheets where they would slip. But the men behind them were young, fast, and equipped with night vision. The gap was closing. "Dad," Sarah gasped, stumbling. "Hazel, she's vibrating." Ben spun around. Sarah had unzipped her jacket slightly. The puppy wasn't shivering from cold, she was convulsing. A seizure brought on by the stress and the altitude. "She's seizing," Sarah cried, her voice rising in panic. "I have to stop. I need to give her the diazepam." "Not here," Ben said, glancing down the slope. He could see the green glow of night vision goggles moving through the timber. "We're exposed. She'll die if I don't," Sarah yelled. She dropped to her knees in the snow, ripping her gloves off with her teeth, fumbling for the medical kit. "Damn it," Ben snarled. He didn't argue. He turned, racking the slide of his rifle. "Do it. Fast." He took a knee 5 yards below her, using a pine trunk as cover. He aimed into the blackness. "Viper 2-6 holding the line," he whispered to himself. A figure emerged from the wideout 20 yards down. Ben didn't hesitate. He fired a warning shot into the tree next to the man's head. The bark exploded. The figure dove for cover. "Back off." Ben roared, his voice booming over the wind. "Federal agent on the ridge. Identify yourselves." It was a bluff, and it bought them 30 seconds. "Done," Sarah shouted, scooping Hazel back up. "She's stabilizing. Let's go." They scrambled the last 100 yards. The fire tower loomed out of the storm like a skeleton finger pointing at the sky. It was rusted, ancient, but it had a steel catwalk and a narrow staircase. High ground. They hit the stairs, boots clanging on the metal. Ben shoved Sarah toward the top. "Get in the box. Keep your head down." He stopped on the landing halfway up. He had a view of the entire approach. But as he looked down, he saw they weren't just behind him. They were flanking. Shadows moved on the left and right. "We're surrounded," Ben realized. He looked up at the trapdoor where Sarah had disappeared. He could hear her on the radio screaming for backup. "State Police, this is Investigator Wilder. Officer down. Heavily armed hostiles at Black Bear Ridge Fire Tower. I need air support. I need everything." "Copy, Investigator Wilder." The dispatcher's voice was faint. "Units are 30 minutes out. The roads are iced over." 30 minutes. They had 3 maybe. Ben Wilder. The voice didn't come from the radio. It came from the base of the tower, amplified by a megaphone. Ben looked down. A man stood in the clearing, unbothered by the storm, wearing a long wool coat over a suit. He wasn't wearing tactical gear. He didn't need to. "Colonel Brennan," Ben called down. "You came a long way to kill a puppy." "I came to fix a mistake," Brennan replied smoothly. "Just like last time. You always did have trouble following orders, Ben. Coordinates are simple things. You just have to read them right." "I read them right," Ben shouted, the anger warming him better than the whiskey ever had. "I saw the logs, Marcus. You changed them. You killed Jake. You killed my squad." Brennan chuckled, a dry sound. "Casualties of war, Ben. Necessary sacrifices for the greater objective. Just like tonight." "She's not a sacrifice." Sarah screamed from the catwalk above, holding Hazel tight. "She's a living thing. She is a failed experiment." Brennan snapped, his composure cracking. "That thing failed every metric. It is defective. It is weak. And I will not let a genetic dead end destroy a billion-dollar program." "She's not defective," Ben said, raising his rifle. She's everything you're not. She cares. And that terrifies you. Take him, Brennan ordered. The men moved. Ben fired. He wasn't aiming to kill, he was aiming to pin. He struck the snow at their feet, forcing them back. But he had a bolt-action rifle against automatic weapons. Give it up, Ben. Brennan walked toward the stairs, arrogant, untouchable. You're an old man with a rusty gun. It's over. Evolution wins. The weak die. The strong adapt. Ben looked at the men closing in. He looked up at his daughter. Sarah, he yelled. When they breach, you jump. You run. No. Sarah cried. No more running. Brennan started up the stairs. He had a pistol in his hand now, a sleek, suppressed weapon. He wasn't sending his men. He wanted to do this himself. He wanted to look Ben in the eye when the light went out. Ben aimed at Brennan's chest. His finger tightened on the trigger. Click. Misfire. The cold had jammed the firing pin. Brennan smiled. He raised his pistol. Goodbye, Corporal. And then a sound cut through the wind. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a high, piercing yelp of distress. Hazel. Inside Sarah's jacket, the puppy had sensed the lethal intent. She let out a cry so sharp, so filled with pure, terrified need, that it triggered a primal reflex in every mammal within earshot. Brennan flinched. For a microsecond, his eyes darted up toward the sound. The defective empathy he despised, the biological signal of distress, distracted him. That microsecond was all Ben needed. He didn't try to fix the gun. He used it as a club. He swung the rifle stock with 20 years of rage behind it. It connected with Brennan's wrist. The pistol flew into the snow. Ben lunged. He tackled Brennan on the metal stairs. They slammed into the railing, teetering over the edge. Brennan was younger, stronger, but Ben was fighting for something more than himself. They rolled. Brennan clawed at Ben's eyes. Ben slammed an elbow into Brennan's throat. This is for Jake, Ben grunted. He pinned Brennan against the grating, his forearm crushing the colonel's windpipe. Brennan's face turned purple. His hands flailed, reaching for a knife on his belt. Ben saw the knife. He grabbed Brennan's wrist, twisting it until it snapped. Brennan screamed. Ben raised his fist. He could end it right here. He wanted to end it. One strike to the temple. It would be justice. It would be war. Dad. Don't. Sarah was on the stairs. She wasn't looking at Brennan. She was looking at Ben. Don't kill him, she pleaded. He goes to trial. They all need to see what he is. If you kill him, he's just a soldier who died in the line of duty. Let him live to be a monster in a cage. Ben froze, his fist hovering inches from Brennan's face. He looked at the man beneath him, gasping, terrified, pathetic. This wasn't a visionary. This was just a man who hurt small things to feel big. Ben slowly lowered his hand. You're right, Ben whispered. He's not worth the bullet. In the distance, the wail of sirens pierced the night. Blue and red lights painted the bottom of the mountain. The state police. The feds. Brennan's security team saw the lights. They didn't fight. They melted back into the woods, leaving their paymaster alone on the stairs. Ben hauled Brennan up by his lapels and shoved him toward Sarah, who slapped handcuffs on him with a satisfying click. Brennan spat blood into the snow. He looked at Ben, his eyes wild. You think this is over? Brennan hissed. I have senators on speed dial. I have generals in my pocket. You have a dead dog and a disgraced record. I am untouchable. Sarah tightened the cuffs until Brennan winced. She leaned in close, holding up the hard drive. We have 3 years of footage, she said coldly. We have the logs. We have Marcus. And we have the puppy. She pulled the zipper of her jacket down just enough. Hazel's head popped out, her amber eyes wide, alive and watching. She's not dead, Colonel, Sarah said. And she's going to be the witness that buries you. Brennan stared at the tiny creature. For the first time he looked afraid. Ben walked past him, down the stairs, toward the lights of the approaching cruisers. He didn't look back at the enemy. He looked down at his shaking hands and then up at the clearing storm. The snow was stopping. But as the officers swarmed the clearing, Ben noticed one of the SUVs was missing. And in the chaos of the arrest, he saw Brennan smile. A small, tight smile directed not at Sarah, but at someone standing in the shadows of the tree line. Ben stopped. The sirens were loud, but the hair on his neck stood up again. The war wasn't over. It had just changed battlefields. Ben thinks he's won, but Brennan's smile suggests the rot goes deeper than one facility. Who was in the shadows? And can a 14-ounce puppy really take down a military-industrial complex in a courtroom? The trial of the century is about to begin, But the most dangerous testimony won't be spoken, it will be felt. The gates of the Mountain Ridge Tactical K-9 Academy did not open for visitors that morning. They were rammed open by an armored Bearcat belonging to the state police, followed by a convoy of unmarked federal SUVs. The raid was surgical, overwhelming, and loud. Sirens cut through the pristine mountain air, shattering the carefully cultivated silence of the facility. Ben Wilder stood by the lead vehicle, watching the chaos unfold. He wasn't wearing a uniform, but he stood with the posture of a man who had taken back his command. Hazel was tucked securely inside his jacket, her head poking out, her amber eyes darting between the flashing lights. "It looks like a country club," Sarah said, stepping up beside him. She was wearing her agency windbreaker, her badge catching the morning sun. She was right. The surface of Mountain Ridge was immaculate. Manicured lawns, state-of-the-art agility courses, polished glass buildings reflecting the pines. A bronze statue of a German shepherd stood in the courtyard, bearing the plaque, "Valor, Discipline, Perfection." "The devil is always well-dressed," Ben muttered. Colonel Brennan was already in custody, but the facility was still staffed. Handlers and administrators were being marched out, zip-tied, looking confused and indignant. They pointed to their permits, their USDA inspections, their framed commendations on the walls. "This is a mistake," a facility manager shouted. "We are a government-contracted research center." "Not anymore," Sarah said, walking past him. They entered the main lobby. It smelled of lemon polish and money. Trophies lined the walls. Photos of dogs shaking hands with senators. It was a temple to excellence. "Where is it?" the lead federal agent asked. "We've cleared the kennels. Nothing but healthy adult dogs. No puppies. No lab." Marcus Chin stepped forward from the group of agents. He looked terrified, but he didn't shrink away. He pointed to a large display case housing a Medal of Honor, not Brennan's but a replica. "Behind the display," Marcus said, his voice trembling, "Maintenance Access Code 774. Ben froze. 774. The wrong coordinates. The numbers that had killed his squad. Brennan hadn't just used them to cover his tracks. He had used them as a password. He had turned his crime into a key. The agents moved the case. A keypad was revealed. The code was punched in. A section of the wall slid back with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a freight elevator. The smell hit them before the doors even opened. It wasn't the smell of a kennel. It was the smell of bleach, ozone, and underlying rot. "Down," Marcus said. "Sublevel 2. The elevator descended. When the doors opened, the illusion of the country club vanished. This was a factory. Concrete floors, fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry wasps, and rows of stainless steel cages. But it was the silence that broke Ben's heart. There were dogs in the cages, puppies. 23 of them. But they weren't barking. They weren't jumping or whining for food. They sat in the back of their wire prisons, watching the agents with dead, flat eyes. "Jesus," the federal agent whispered. Sarah moved to the nearest cage. A puppy, maybe 8 weeks old, shrank away from her hand. On the cage door, a red plastic tag hung from a hook. "What does the red tag mean?" Sarah asked, though she already knew. Marcus couldn't look. "Disposal scheduled. Within 24 hours. Ben walked down the row. "Red tag. Red tag. Red tag." 23 lives marked for death because they didn't measure up to a madman's standard of perfection. Hazel shifted against his chest, letting out a soft woof. At the sound, the puppy in the nearest cage lifted its head. Its ears twitched. A spark of life. "They're sedated," Ava said, moving quickly down the line with her medical team. "He keeps them drugged to keep them quiet. We need to get them out. Now." While the medics began the evacuation, Sarah and the investigators pushed deeper, into the glass-walled office at the back. This was the brain of the operation. Files were stacked on the desk. A whiteboard displayed genetic trees, lines drawn between sires and dams, with notes in red marker. Isolate aggression gene. Suppress bonding hormone. The Tactical Genome Project, Sarah read from a binder on the desk. Goal: creation of the emotionless working animal. Specifications: 0 hesitation, 0 bonding requirement, absolute lethal obedience. "He wasn't breeding dogs," Ben said, staring at the whiteboard. "He was trying to breed soldiers who wouldn't question orders." "And look at the money," Sarah said, opening a ledger. 15 million in contracts. Private security firms. Offshore mercenaries. She turned a page, her finger tracing a line of payments. Kickbacks. Consulting fees. $200,000 a pop. She stopped. Her finger hovered over a name in the authorized by column. Dad, she said softly. You need to see this. Ben walked over. He looked at the name Brennan had been paying. The man who had signed off on the grants. The man who had ensured no inspectors ever looked in the basement. General Richard Morrison. Ben felt the room tilt. Morrison, Ben whispered. Jake's father. The man who had stood at Jake's funeral, weeping, clutching the folded flag. The man who had looked at Ben with eyes full of hatred, blaming the corporal for his son's death. He knew, Ben rasped. He's been funding Brennan for years. He was Brennan's main contact, Sarah said, her voice shaking with rage. He helped secure the military status. He protected this place. Ben leaned against the desk, the weight of 20 years crashing down. The man whose forgiveness Ben had craved, the father of the boy he thought he'd killed, was a partner in the butchery. Jake died because Brennan couldn't read a map, Ben said, his voice hollow. And his own father paid Brennan millions to torture dogs. It doesn't make Jake's death make sense, Dad, Sarah said gently, placing a hand on his arm. But it shows you what kind of men were giving the orders. You were never one of them. You were just the scapegoat. Corporal Wilder. An agent called from the back of the room. He was standing in front of a heavy industrial door. A walk-in freezer. We need to document this, the agent said grimly. Ben walked over. The agent opened the heavy door. Inside, on metal racks, lay the failures that hadn't been thrown in the creek. 47 small bodies, preserved in plastic bags, labeled with dates and cause of termination. Too timid. Refused to bite. Cowered at loud noise. Ben looked at the rows of frozen potential. He didn't look away. He bore witness. He felt Hazel's warm heart beating against his ribs, a frantic counter-rhythm to the cold death in front of him. He kept them, Marcus said from the doorway, tears finally streaming down his face. He kept them to study their brains. To see where the weakness lived. Ben reached into his jacket and covered Hazel's eyes with his hand. She didn't need to see this. She had already survived it. By noon, the media trucks had surrounded the mountain base. The story was too big to contain. Military contractor arrested in House of Horrors raid. General implicated in animal cruelty ring. Ben stood on the periphery watching the spectacle. He saw the cages being wheeled out, loaded into rescue vans. 23 puppies, blinking in the sunlight they were never meant to see. Ava was coordinating the transport, her phone glued to her ear, calling in favors from every foster network on the East Coast. Marcus Chin stood before a bank of microphones, flanked by federal agents. He had been granted immunity in exchange for his testimony. He looked small, tired, but for the first time he wasn't looking at the ground. I processed the paperwork, Marcus told the cameras, his voice steady. I knew what was happening. I was too afraid to stop it. A reporter shouted a question. Why did you turn on him now? Marcus looked over the crowd. He found Ben standing by the police line. He found the small, pointed ears poking out of Ben's jacket. I couldn't save them all, Marcus said into the microphone. But I saved her. And she saved us. Ben turned away from the cameras. He walked over to Sarah, who was closing the back of her SUV. They're safe, Sarah said. Every single one of them. We have fosters lined up. They're going to be dogs, Dad. Just dogs. And Brennan? Ben asked. He's in federal custody. No bail. Sarah hesitated. But Morrison, he's not in cuffs yet. He's claiming ignorance, saying he was a silent investor. Ben looked at the mountain, pristine and white against the blue sky. The rot had been cut out, but the roots went deep. He won't get away with it, Ben said. Not this time. He patted the bulge in his jacket. Hazel yawned, tired but safe, her ordeal finally over. Let's go home, girl, Ben whispered. We got work to do. As they walked toward the truck, Ben felt a lightness he hadn't known in decades. But as he unlocked the door, his phone buzzed. A blocked number. Ben answered. Wilder. The voice on the other end was old, gravelly, and familiar. It wasn't Brennan. You've kicked over a very expensive anthill, Corporal, General Morrison said. Do you really think a few dead puppies are going to bring down the Pentagon's favorite project? Ben tightened his grip on the phone. I think 23 live ones might. And a witness who knows about Grid 774. There was a pause. A cold, static silence. Enjoy your victory lap, Ben, the general said softly. But watch your back. Accidents happen in the mountains all the time. The line went dead. Ben looked at the phone, then at Sarah, who was smiling as she watched a puppy being loaded into a van. He looked at Hazel, whose amber eyes were closed in peaceful sleep. The rescue was over. The war had just begun. General Morrison isn't just fighting for his reputation. He's fighting to bury the secrets of the past. He thinks he can intimidate Ben, but he's forgotten one thing. Ben Wilder isn't alone anymore. The trial is coming, and while Morrison has generals and lawyers, Ben has the truth, and a 14-ounce puppy who has already survived the impossible. The federal courthouse smelled of floor wax and old paper, a dry, sterile scent that usually made Ben Wilder want to run for the nearest exit. But today he walked through the metal detectors with a steady pulse. He wasn't alone. Trotting beside him, wearing a small red vest marked emotional support animal, was Hazel. It had been 6 weeks since the raid. She had doubled her weight, which meant she was now a whopping 2.5 pounds. Her fur had grown back in plush, dark waves, covering the scars on her flank. She would never be a normal German shepherd. The dwarfism ensured she would always look like an eternal puppy, but her eyes were bright, clear, and focused on Ben's left boot. Sarah walked on his other side, her hand brushing his arm occasionally. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore, it was comfortable. "You ready?" she asked as they reached the heavy oak doors of Courtroom 4. Ben looked down at Hazel. She sat instantly, looking up at him with that amber gaze that seemed to know everything he was feeling. "We are," Ben said. Inside, the gallery was packed. Reporters, animal rights advocates, and curious civilians filled the benches. At the defense table sat Colonel Marcus Brennan, looking impeccable in a Navy suit. He didn't look like a man facing 47 counts of animal cruelty and federal fraud. He looked like a CEO bored by a shareholder meeting. The trial had been grueling. The prosecution had laid out a mountain of evidence. The frozen bodies, the financial records, the videos that made the jurors weep. But Brennan's defense team was expensive and ruthless. They argued that the Mountain Ridge Academy was an agricultural facility, that the dogs were livestock, and that culling was standard industry practice for genetic improvement. They tried to turn the slaughter of puppies into a farming dispute. Then came the witnesses. Marcus Chin took the stand first. He looked small in the witness box, but his voice didn't waver as he detailed the disposal protocols. The defense attacked him viciously, painting him as a disgruntled employee with a history of mental instability, but Marcus held his ground. "I might be unstable," Marcus said quietly, "but I didn't kill 47 dogs." "He did." Ava followed, presenting the medical evidence. She held up the photos of Hazel's burned paws, the toxicology reports showing the deliberate poisoning. The jury flinched. Brennan checked his watch. And then they called Ben. "The prosecution calls Benjamin Wilder." Ben stood up. Hazel moved with him, but Sarah held her leash. "She stays here, Dad. You got this." Ben walked to the stand. He swore to tell the truth, a concept he had wrestled with for 2 decades. The defense attorney, a sharp-faced man named Sterling, didn't waste time. His strategy was simple: destroy the witness to destroy the narrative. "Mr. Wilder," Sterling began, pacing in front of the jury box. "You are currently unemployed, is that correct?" "I am retired," Ben said. "Retired?" Sterling smirked. "You live alone in a cabin with no electricity. You have a history of alcohol abuse. And isn't it true that you were discharged from the Army under questionable circumstances?" "Objection," the prosecutor called out. "Relevance." "It goes to credibility, Your Honor," Sterling argued smoothly. "Mr. Wilder claims to have moral authority here. But his own record suggests a history of poor judgment and catastrophic failure." The judge nodded. "I'll allow it." Sterling turned to Ben, his eyes predatory. "Isn't it true, Mr. Wilder, that 20 years ago, during Operation Red Sand, your command decisions led to the deaths of 3 soldiers under your direct supervision, including Private Jake Morrison?" The courtroom went silent. This was the kill shot. The moment Ben was supposed to crumble, to let the shame break him just like it had for 20 years. Ben looked at Brennan. The colonel was watching him, a faint, smug smile playing on his lips. "You were always weak, Ben." Ben took a breath. He didn't look down. He didn't shake. "I was told I killed those men," Ben said, his voice carrying to the back of the room. "I believed it for 20 years. I destroyed my life over it." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a folded document, the declassified after-action report Sarah had pulled from the archives, combined with the unredacted comms log Marcus had provided. "But the truth is a stubborn thing," Ben continued. "This is the original transmission log from that night. Grid coordinates 774. Sterling frowned. "Objection. This is not." It is evidence, Ben said, cutting him off. Entered as Exhibit D by the prosecution this morning. He looked directly at Brennan. The colonel's smile vanished. I called in the right coordinates, Ben said clearly. 770. But the operations coordinator, Major Marcus Brennan, relayed them as 774. He made the error. He dropped the bomb on us. And then he altered the record and let me burn for it. A gasp went through the gallery. The jury looked from Ben to Brennan. The colonel's face had gone the color of ash. He taught me a lesson that day, Ben said, turning to the jury. He taught me that you can kill more than bodies. You can kill truth. You can kill responsibility. You can kill compassion. That is what he did to those puppies. He looked at life and saw only product. He looked at gentleness and saw only weakness. He killed everything that makes life worth living. Ben looked down at Sarah and at the tiny dog sitting at her feet. This puppy, Ben pointed to Hazel. She survived because someone finally couldn't kill his conscience. She is alive because caring isn't a defect and it isn't a weakness. It is the only thing that matters. Sterling stood there, his mouth open, his attack strategy shattered. He had no more questions. The prosecution's closing argument was the final nail. This case is about what we become when we treat life as a commodity, the prosecutor said, standing before the jury. The defendant created a system that valued obedience over love, aggression over gentleness, and profit over life. He called it evolution. We call it what it is, evil wearing a medal. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman didn't look at Brennan. We find the defendant, Marcus Brennan, guilty on all counts. The sentence came swiftly. 15 years in federal prison. $2 million in fines. A lifetime ban from owning or working with animals. General Morrison, named as a co-conspirator, was stripped of his rank pending a separate military tribunal. The gavel banged, a sound like a gunshot, but this time nobody died. The courtroom erupted in low murmurs of relief. Sarah let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for weeks. She squeezed Ben's hand. We did it, Dad. Officers moved to take Brennan into custody. They handcuffed him, the metal clicking shut on the wrist that had signed so many death warrants. As they led him past the witness stand, Brennan stopped. He looked at Ben. His eyes were cold, dead things. You think this changes anything? Brennan hissed. You were always weak, Wilder. That's why you failed. Ben stood up. He looked the man in the eye, and for the first time, he saw Brennan not as a superior officer, not as a monster, but as something small. Something pathetic. No, Ben said quietly. I'm still here. Jake's father is going to face justice. Those 23 puppies have homes. Ben reached down and picked up Hazel. She rested her chin on his arm, looking at Brennan with nothing but mild curiosity. And you, Ben said, will spend 15 years learning what it means to be caged. He turned his back on the colonel. I didn't fail. I survived. Brennan was dragged away, shouting something about ingratitude and the future, but nobody was listening. Ben walked out of the courtroom into the bright afternoon sun. The air was crisp, smelling of spring thaw. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but Ben didn't stop. He walked to his truck, set Hazel in the passenger seat, and climbed in beside her. He felt lighter than he had in 20 years. The ghost of Jake Morrison wasn't sitting in the back seat anymore. The bottle wasn't waiting for him at the cabin. We're going home, Hazel, Ben said, starting the engine. But as he pulled out of the parking lot, he saw a black sedan parked across the street. The window rolled down halfway. A man in a military uniform sat in the back, watching him. It wasn't General Morrison. It was someone younger, harder. Someone who looked like they were assessing a threat. The car pulled away, disappearing into traffic. Ben's hand instinctively went to Hazel's fur. The trial was over. Brennan was gone. But you didn't take down a $15 million operation without making enemies who preferred shadows to courtrooms. The verdict is in, but the black sedan suggests that the Tactical Genome Project might have other stakeholders who aren't happy about their assets being frozen. Ben and Hazel have found peace, but can they keep it? Spring arrived in the Blue Ridge Mountains not as a whisper, but as a riot. The ice that had choked the creek for months shattered into crystalline shards, carried away by rushing water that tasted of iron and earth. The gray skeletons of the hemlocks burst into shocking green, and the air, once sharp enough to cut, now smelled of wet soil and pine resin. Ben Wilder stood on the porch of his cabin, watching a small boy try to walk silently through the mud. Heel to toe, Leo, Ben called out gently. If you step flat, you snap the twigs. You gotta roll your weight. The boy, 8 years old with messy dark hair and knees stained with grass, frowned in concentration. He took a careful step, rolling his foot. Silence. He looked back at Ben, his face splitting into a gap-toothed grin. I did it, Grandpa. Ben felt that word hit him in the chest. Grandpa. It was a title he had spent 5 years running from, convinced he would poison the boy just by being near him. Now it was the only rank that mattered. Good job, Scout, Ben said. A flash of black and tan shot past Leo's legs. Hazel, now 6 months old, was bounding through the tall grass. She hadn't grown much in height. She would always be small, a permanent puppy in a frozen state of youth due to her genetics, but she was solid. Her coat was thick and glossy, her movements quick and assured. She circled Leo, barking a high, happy sound that echoed off the ridges. Leo laughed, dropping to his knees to wrestle with her. Inside the cabin, the transformation was just as stark. The dust and the empty whiskey bottles were gone. The windows were clean, letting in the afternoon light. On the mantelpiece, where once there had been only shadows, there were framed photographs. Sarah's wedding picture, Leo's school portrait, and a candid shot of Ben and Ava, standing in front of the clinic, looking tired but content. Sarah walked out onto the porch holding 2 mugs of coffee. She watched her son and the dog rolling in the grass. He talks about this place all week, Sarah said, handing Ben a mug. He tells his friends his grandfather lives in a fortress. Ben took a sip. It used to be a fortress. Now, it's just a house. Hazel suddenly stopped playing. She sat up, her ears swiveling. Leo had stopped laughing. His face had crumpled in the sudden, inexplicable frustration that sometimes hits 8-year-olds. A scrapped knee, a lost toy, a moment of overwhelming feeling. Before Leo could cry, Hazel was there. She didn't jump on him. She pressed her side firmly against his chest, grounding him. She licked his cheek once, deliberately, then rested her chin on his shoulder, letting out a long, calm exhale. Leo's breathing synced with hers. His hands buried themselves in her fur. The moment of crisis passed, dissolved by a creature who had been bred to kill but had chosen to heal. She always knows, Sarah whispered, watching them. Brennan tried to breathe that out of her. He wanted a machine. He failed, Ben said softly. He wanted a soldier. He got a medic. The following Saturday, they drove down the mountain to the community center in Asheville. The parking lot was full. Banners hung from the ceiling. Mountain Ridge Rescue and Rehabilitation. It was the final adoption ceremony for the 23 puppies liberated from the basement. Ben stood in the back, Hazel in his arms. She was wearing her red vest, watching the crowd with the calm authority of a supervisor. Ava was at the microphone, looking radiant. She read the names, and one by one families came up to the stage. These weren't just random adoptions. Ben and Ava had vetted every single one. There was a retired Marine corporal with PTSD who took a shy female puppy. There was a school teacher who took a boisterous male. And then a young couple walked up with their son, a boy with sensory processing disorder who wore noise-canceling headphones and held his mother's hand tightly. They were given a puppy who had been marked with a red tag for excessive passivity. The puppy didn't bark. He walked straight to the boy and sat on his feet. The boy, who usually flinched at touch, reached down and stroked the soft ears. A smile, rare and beautiful, broke across his face. The father looked at Ben, tears in his eyes. They told us he might be broken because of where he came from. Ben looked at the dog, then at the boy. He's not broken, Ben said, his voice thick with emotion. He's extraordinary. Marcus Chen was there too. He stood by the exit, looking healthier, the haunted look in his eyes replaced by a quiet resolve. He was working with a national advocacy group now, helping to rewrite laws on animal testing in defense contracts. He walked over to Ben. He didn't offer a hand, he just nodded at Hazel. You gave her a chance, Marcus said softly. That gave me one too. We all got a second chance, Marcus, Ben replied. Don't waste it. Late that night, back at the cabin, Ben sat at the kitchen table. The only light came from the kerosene lamp he still preferred over the electric ones. He opened a leather-bound journal. For years, his hands had been too shaky to write. Now the script was jagged but legible. He wasn't writing about the coordinates anymore. He wasn't writing about the fire. Day 127, he wrote. Talked to Jake's mother today. She forgave me. She said I was carrying weight that was never mine to hold. She said Jake loved me. Maybe she's right. Maybe I can finally put it down. He closed the book. The silence of the cabin wasn't heavy. It was just peaceful. He went out to the porch where Hazel was waiting. She thumped her tail against the floorboards as he sat down. The stars were out, a million pinpricks of light above the timberline. Sarah came out a moment later, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. She sat beside him in the rocking chair. "You know you can visit us, right?" she said, looking out at the dark woods. "You don't have to wait for me to bring Leo here. You have a room at our house. A real bed." Ben looked at his hands. "I know. I'm working on that. The city is still loud for me. We can make it quiet," she promised. Then she turned to him. "Dad, look at what you did. You saved her life. You exposed a monster. You came back from the dead. You can do anything." Ben looked down at Hazel. She was asleep on his boot, twitching as she dreamed. "She did the hard part," Ben murmured. "I just showed up." The phone in Ben's pocket buzzed. It was late for a social call. Ben pulled it out. "Ava," he answered. "Hey." "Ben." Ava's voice was clipped, professional, but with that underlying current of urgency he had learned to recognize. "There's been a situation. Police in Ashe County found a barn. Hoarding case. There's a Malinois chained in the back. Exposure, starvation. The vet on site says he's not expected to make it through the night." Ben sat up straighter. Hazel woke up instantly, her ears perked. "Why are you calling me?" Ben asked. "Because he's aggressive," Ava said. "He won't let anyone near him. They're talking about putting him down for safety. They're asking for you specifically. They heard about the veteran who speaks the language of the broken." Ben looked at Sarah. He looked at Hazel. He looked at the mountain that had held his grief for 20 years like a tomb. He felt something he hadn't felt since before the war. It was a tightening in his chest, but it wasn't panic. It was purpose. It was the feeling of being needed, not to destroy but to protect. "Tell them I'm coming," Ben said, standing up. "And I'm bringing help." He hung up. He didn't need to tell Sarah what was happening. She was already standing. "Want company?" she asked. Ben smiled, a real smile, one that reached his eyes and stayed there. "Always." 10 minutes later, the old Ford truck rumbled to life. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the gravel road leading down the mountain. Hazel sat in the passenger seat, alert and calm, watching the road ahead. Sarah followed in her SUV, her headlights painting Ben's tailgate. They wound their way down the switchbacks, leaving the isolation of the high country behind. The mountains in the rearview mirror were no longer a hiding place. They were just a home. Redemption isn't forgetting what broke you, Ben thought as he shifted gears, the engine roaring a challenge to the night. It's choosing to protect what remains. It's learning that survival isn't enough. You have to live. And sometimes the smallest life shows you how. Ben Wilder spent 20 years convinced he couldn't save anyone. Then a puppy the size of his palm, left to die in ice water, taught him the truth. We don't save others to prove we're worthy. We do it because caring is the only thing that ever mattered. Hazel was bred to be emotionless. Instead, she felt everything. And in feeling, she reminded a broken man what it meant to be human. Ben reached over and rested his hand on Hazel's head. She leaned into his touch, her amber eyes reflecting the road ahead. "Ready, partner?" Ben whispered. Hazel gave a sharp, affirmative bark. They drove into the darkness, not to hide in it, but to light it up. Ben Wilder almost walked past that creek. He almost left her to the cold. Most people would have kept walking. Now you have a choice too. You can scroll past this story and let it fade into the algorithm, or you can prove that stories like this matter. Don't leave Hazel in the cold again. Hit like to keep her warm, subscribe to join the pack that fights for the broken, and comment, "I stayed," so we know you're one of the good ones.